B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins. News and comment. It's Tuesday, January 22nd, 2019. Hope you enjoyed the long holiday weekend with the Martin Luther King holiday yesterday. Many in the east and central parts of the United States were hammered by a snowstorm and brutal cold temperatures. I hope you're hunkered down and doing okay. And a quick programming note, there will be no podcast tomorrow. I'm shooting a video and won't be able to serve up a podcast. Be back at you on Thursday. And as I left you on Friday, Buzzfeed's big story was dominating the news cycle. And late in the day, Robert Mueller's office issued a very curious non-denial denial. We'll get to that in a moment. Now, if you listened to my comments on Friday, I was a little cautious about the basis of Buzzfeed's claim that Michael Cohen was told by Trump to lie to Congress about the Trump-Moscow project. And it's because it was based on two anonymous sources. And they referred to available evidence that they did not cite. And in media interviews, one of the writers, Anthony Cormier, said that he hadn't seen the evidence that supports these two unnamed sources, but Jason Leopold, his co-author, said he had seen some of them. Then the special counsel issued this statement, which is not a full denial. Peter Carr, who is the spokesperson for Robert Mueller, said, Buzzfeed's description of specific statements to the special counsel's office and characterization of documents and testimony obtained by this office regarding Michael Cohen's congressional testimony are not accurate. Okay. Now, it doesn't explicitly say that they are denying the thrust of the article, that Cohen was instructed to tell a certain story to Congress. And one of the reasons I believe that this is plausible is that Trump was so bitter when the FBI, using a warrant from the Manhattan District Attorney, went and searched Michael Cohen's law office and his residence in a hotel where he had some stuff. And Trump said that's the end of attorney-client privilege. And I believe he felt he was bulletproof when he was talking to Cohen because he was a lawyer. And we have the one tape recording where they're kind of talking in code about the deal with the National Enquirer. And Cohen basically says, well, you know, I got to get the money for that, boss. And Trump basically approves it. He doesn't say, go pay that woman so she won't talk. It was a coded conversation. So BuzzFeed claims there were 10 of those exchanges. And as I mentioned on Friday, I've known Jason Leopold for 15 years now. And I have respect for the reporting that he does based on the Freedom of Information Act. Some of the great reporting that he's done at Guantanamo, on Abu Zubaydah's brother, on many other stories. Jason Leopold is a highly credible journalist. And it's interesting because, what's his name? I think Peter Smith is the editor at BuzzFeed. And when Jason Leopold's checkered past was raised, and by the way, that term comes from Leopold himself. He says, yeah, I have a checkered past. And he wrote a book about it, News Junkie. It is not secret. But at that point, Peter Smith said, well, he was nominated for a Pulitzer in 2018. And when you look at the reporting for which Leopold and other BuzzFeed reporters were nominated, it was a series of stories about people who have been killed attributed to Vladimir Putin. Most of those stories took place in England. And the reporting was littered with official sources who could not be named, evidence that was excluded from our view. And while I don't doubt the general thrust of what they reported, it was not great journalism. And I don't believe worthy of a Pulitzer Prize. So I'm going to share with you in a minute a link to my podcast interview with Jason Leopold a year ago, November, where he got very defensive when I challenged him on using these unnamed sources. And at that point, it was an article about CrowdStrike, the security company that was hired by the DNC to investigate the hack, the leak. It's littered with former FBI people. I mean, it's... Anyway, I have this complicated connection to Jason Leopold. I like him personally. I care about him as a human being. But when it comes to his work product, well, this was another stinker. And I'm grateful to Glenn Greenwald, because after the Buzzfeed story was slammed by the corporate media that is so hypocritical, because it has chased the Russiagate narrative and dropped the ball over 50 times. And I started to make a list of the ones that I remember. And fortunately, Glenn Greenwald, who I think has some research assistance, ended up with a 54-page summary. And in a tweak of BuzzFeed, oh, and by the way, their editor is Ben Smith, not Peter Smith. I misstated his first name. Anyway, BuzzFeed really annoys me because they have so many listicles. 10 reasons why Ariana Grande should have left Pete Davidson, and, 9 ways to thin thighs in 30 minutes, and just all that Hollywood tripe. And those listicles really bother me. I've told Jason that, and he said, well, that's what pays the bills. That's what gets people to the site. At any rate, Greenwald created his own listicle. It's the 10 worst, most embarrassing U.S. media failures on the Trump-Russia story. And like BuzzFeed, he even did it in descending order. And I'm going to briefly recap the 10 that he cites along with some honorable mentions. But he points out that this reverse listing measures the magnitude of the embarrassment, the hysteria they generated in social media and cable news, the level of journalistic recklessness that produced them, and the amount of danger and damage that they caused. And he says, note that all of these errors go in only one direction. If these were honorable journalists who were really fair and balanced, the errors would be 50-50, right? Some that benefit Trump and some that don't. But he says virtually all of the major errors in this story are devoted to the same agenda and script. So number 10, the false report that RT was hacked into and taken over. That RT hacked into and took over C-SPAN. That's from June of 2017. You remember that one? Well, it was just a routing error. Nobody got hacked. Number 9, Russian hackers invaded the U.S. electric grid and were threatening to deny electricity to the citizens of the Green Mountain state of Vermont. Remember that one from December of 2016? It went away pretty quickly. Number 8, a new deranged anonymous group declares mainstream political sites on the left and right to be Russian propaganda outlets, and the Washington Post touts its report to claim massive Kremlin infiltration of the Internet. That was around Thanksgiving of 2016. Remember, prop or not? And they listed arbitrarily all of these media outlets, including Truth Out, Truth Dig, Black Agenda Report, Naked Capitalism, and declared that they were pro-Russian and that Russian propaganda was creeping into their reporting. That was the Washington Post's big blunder, and I don't know that they've worn a hair shirt or taken any punishment as a result. Number 7, the Mooch, Trump aide Anthony Scaramucci, was allegedly involved in a Russian hedge fund. That was reported by CNN team, including a guy who used to work at the New York Times, and that would have been Eric Lichtblau, and they all got fired. And CNN took down the story. One of the things that Greenwald complains about is that when these media outlets fail, they hide their errors. They pull it down so that you can't find it again. Where did number 6 go? I'm sorry, I have a bunch of paper here. Russia attacked U.S. diplomats at the Cuban embassy using a super sophisticated sonic microwave weapon. All of the media bid on that one. And now we know it was crickets. But there was a whole Russia hysteria that was generated by that. Number 5, Trump created a secret internet server to covertly communicate with a Russian bank. Well, that was broken by Slate, and it has been debunked. But that didn't stop Rachel Maddow from mentioning it last week on MSNBC. The corrections just don't catch up with the promoters of Russiagate. Then we go to number 4, and this one I know is the pet peeve of Glenn Greenwald. The false report by The Guardian and Luke Harding that Paul Manafort had visited Julian Assange 3 times at the embassy in London. Then there's number 3, CNN explicitly lied about Lanny Davis being its source for a story whose substance was also false, that Cohen would testify that Trump knew in advance about the meeting with the Russians at Trump Tower. And that story, of course, falls on CNN's shoulders. Number 2 is the Buzzfeed story from Friday. And, gosh, I don't have a drum roll handy here. But just imagine a drum roll. And the top of the listicle, according to Glenn Greenwald, was the story advanced by CNN and MSNBC that Don Jr. was offered advanced access to the WikiLeaks email archive, and they had failed to properly read the metadata on the tweets and emails in question. In the dishonorable mention category, Brian Ross was fired for reporting that Trump told, from ABC News, that Trump told Mike Flynn to make contact with the Russians. The Times claims, most recently, that Manafort provided polling data to Russian oligarch Oleg Deripaska, when in fact he gave it to Ukrainians, not Russians. Rachel Maddow's 20-minute screed about how they tried to trick her by sending her a fake top-secret document modeled after one published in The Intercept, but it wasn't true. The U.S. media and Democrats spent 6 months claiming that all 17 intelligence agencies agreed that Russia was behind the alleged hacks at the DNC. The AP messed up in February of 2018, saying that it was the Free Beacon that had commissioned the Steele dossier, and the list goes on and on. To me, the most egregious is across the corporate media today. They all treat as fact the claim that Russia hacked the DNC and gave the spoils to WikiLeaks. We still, 2 years in, do not have any evidence of that, but it is treated as a fact time after time, report after report. I've linked to Joe Laria's story over at Consortium News about his encounter with Jason Leopold. Leopold had just published his memoir called News Junkie, and Laria was writing a review of it for, I think, the London Times. And when they met, they, traded a little chit-chat, and Joe Laria later learned that Leopold picked up on the details that he had, that Laria had shared with him, that he freelanced for the London Times, and that he also had acquired Joe Laria's cell phone number. So 3 days later, Leopold broke the story that Karl Rove had been indicted. And I was one of the people who believed Jason Leopold, and I reported that at the time to my great chagrin. But what Laria points out is that Leopold, in trying to confirm his belief that Karl Rove had been indicted, appears to have falsely used Joe Laria's name in an interview that he conducted to try to confirm the information about Rove and the indictment. So it's a real sordid story, and it appears to be true. I've shared it for your consumption in the show file for today's podcast. And I've also linked to my most recent interview, as I mentioned, with Jason Leopold from November of 17. And during the interview, I played a clip from listener Kyle Kyleman, who had called into my Facebook Live show the week or two before. And he had been very disappointed by Leopold's reporting, and he said so. And you could hear how much that really hurt Leopold and how defensive he was in that exchange. And speaking of the DNC and those alleged hackers, well, the Democratic National Committee reported last week they believe it was targeted in a hacking attempt by a Russian group, including Cozy Bear and Fancy Bear. after the 2018 midterm elections. Now, they cite a different cybersecurity firm called FireEye, and we don't have much other evidence to go on, but they're still working that angle. And I am still highly skeptical. Now, I still am scratching my head about why Congress, at the behest of the Trump administration and under the direction of Treasury Secretary Mnuchin, lifted sanctions or eased them on Oleg Deripaska, the Russian oligarch, and his aluminum company, Rusal. And a further analysis shows that while the Trump team said that this was tough on Russia, tough on Deripaska, it frees Deripaska of hundreds of millions of dollars in debt while leaving him and his allies with majority ownership of his most important company. So that is a real stinker of a move. And as you know, I don't particularly support the original sanctions that were imposed because I don't think there is enough evidence to sustain that. But why would you lift sanctions at this stage on a select oligarch? It doesn't make sense. You just can't find a sensible way to explain it. Every day I pause for a moment to thank the people like you who support my work at the Peter B. Collins Podcast with your subscriptions. Fine folks like Alice Carlson, Susan Lewis, John Morgan, and Steve Wazensky. They kick in $5 or $10 a month each, and you can do it too. All you have to do is drop by peterbcollins.com, click on menu, click on Become a Subscriber. You'll land on the sign-up page, and it's easy. You choose a PayPal level of support that you like. And if you're allergic to PayPal, I understand, you can address your communications to me at Box 150-660, San Rafael, California, 94915. So, in honor of Martin Luther King Day, the King family joined forces with members of the Kennedy clan and with a group of 60 prominent American citizens, activists, historians. They are demanding reopening the investigations into all of the 1960s assassinations, JFK, RFK, MLK, and I would add Malcolm X to the list too, because I've never been convinced how that one happened. And that is on the list, I want to just assure you. Anyway, they are demanding a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, calling for Congress to set that up and to release all government documents related to the Kennedy presidency and assassination as mandated by the Act of Congress in 1992. They also call for public inquest into the 4 major assassinations of the 60s that together had a disastrous impact on the course of American history. I think this is an important step. It's going to take a long time, but we must learn the truth about this. And I want to direct you over to whowhatwhy.com, where it's .org, I'm sorry, whowhatwhy.org, where my colleague Jeff Schechtman has just posted a podcast with San Francisco journalist and author, a founder of Salon, David Talbot. And he has been a deep investigator of the conspiracies of the 1960s, and I think you'll find that a very informative discussion. Talbot has been central to this move to set up and promote the new investigations. So on Saturday, I turned on the TV, and there was Trump speaking from the White House. No salutation. He just walked up to the podium and started talking. And right away, I noticed he was more subdued, and it's like somebody tased him and said, "Act presidential, can you?" And so he came across as much less confrontational. He was devoted to humanitarian issues related to migrants. He wants to build a wall to protect them. And he didn't do his usual name-calling and demonizing of the Democrats. He was talking about, compromise and reaching out and trying to move forward. And I believe he must have been on some kind of heavy medication, because it had all worn off by Sunday morning when he went into another tweet storm attacking Nancy Pelosi. And I won't bother to repeat his tweets because it's just the usual bullshit. But his mood swings and the range of the behavior that he models is amazing. And I am scheduled to talk with the author of Trump on the Couch, Washington psychiatrist Justin Frank, in the next few weeks. So we'll certainly discuss that with him. Anyway, Trump's compromise includes a bunch of poison pills. Number one, he is saying that he will just so grandly offer a 3-year deferral to the Dreamers under the DACA program and to about 300,000 people he's targeted for removal from the country. These are called special privileges or special access, and these are people who came here because of a calamity like a war or an earthquake or hurricane. And Trump has given them instructions to leave, but he's willing to delay that for 3 years. So they'll still be hostages, but they'll get a 3-year reprieve. And now we learn that the language that was negotiated between Jared Kushner and Mitch McConnell includes drastic changes to the asylum laws in the United States to essentially put a cap on the number of people who can apply and to restrict its availability to children. Now, not only is this cruel, heartless, and immoral, it has triggered a further negative response from Democrats. They'd put some sweeteners in there, $13 billion for disaster relief, renewing the Violence Against Women Act, and a few other things. But it's not going anywhere. So the government remains shut down more than a month after that began. And one of the claims that Trump has made is that his wall will stop all drugs from entering the United States, like they walk in by themselves. And we know that only 10% of drug trafficking occurs outside the traditional checkpoints. So they don't have mules, including burros, carrying satchels of marijuana and cocaine and meth and fentanyl and heroin over the desert areas of our southern border. 90% of it comes in through smuggling in cars and trucks and tunnels. And a lot of that is being exposed in the El Chapo trial in New York right now. The New York Times quotes the former head of the Immigration and Naturalization Service, which no longer exists, Doris Meisner. The idea that people are walking drugs across the border as though they're illegal immigrants who would then be stopped by a wall across the border, well, that is not the pattern. So, once again, it is a solution that doesn't fit the problem, except in the fertile mind of one Donald J. Trump. Then the Supreme Court today issued a surprise decision, which at least now takes away the leverage that Trump had over the Dreamers, because they have issued a ruling basically that they're not going to take up the case and lower court rulings will stand. And this was despite the urgent appeal from the White House that this must be heard by the court immediately. And so this is a real setback for Trump. And it further undermines his attempt to claim that he has compromised in the deal that he articulated on Saturday. Then, when the Democrats got to look at the legislation that the Republicans ginned up last night, it specifies that children younger than 18 from Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala cannot apply for asylum at the U.S. border. Instead, they would be turned away for their own safety, Trump says, because of a new requirement that they apply from their home country. And it would create a cap on 15,000 on the number of children who could qualify for asylum each year. This is Stephen Miller's handiwork. You can pretty well see that. So even when Trump claims that he wants a deal, he's trying to reach out to Democrats, he's, trying to be Mr. Compromise, it's bullshit. They just keep adding these elements to make it impossible for Democrats to support it. And I'm pleased to see that Pelosi and Schumer have started using the language of hostage-taking and that Trump is committing extortion here, because that's what it is. The court also surprised me by temporarily allowing Trump's ban on service in the military by transgender persons to stand. Now, it has a carve-out for people who are already in the military, but it was a 5-4 vote, and you can see that Catholic Brett Kavanaugh supported Trump on this. There is no rational basis to do this. It is simply to pander to the base, including Catholics, who look at transgenders and say, ew, I don't even want to know about that. And there we are. Also, a surprise from the Supreme Court. They have taken up a case based on New York's very restrictive gun possession law. It flatly prohibits residents from removing their lawfully purchased and duly registered handguns from the city limits, even to transport them loaded and locked up to a second home outside of New York City. Now, that is a very restrictive law. I can imagine this court with Kavanaugh and his beer. They're going to use it to not just overturn the New York regulation, but they'll do much, much more, in my opinion. Now, when I woke up Sunday morning, my Facebook newsfeed, one after another, was filled with this one picture of the kid from Covington, Kentucky, with his MAGA red hat on in Washington, D.C., and he was smirking. We now know his name is Nick Sandmann, and he attends Covington Catholic. I grew up across the river in Cincinnati, and, these were sports rivals, and I think we debated their debate team one time. But Covington Catholic is more of a traditional conservative Catholic school, and they allowed their kids to attend the March for Life, the anti-abortion life march in Washington. And apparently they didn't know there would also be some aggressive Muslim African Americans, or are they Christians? I don't know exactly. And there was also a group of Native Americans. They all had permits to march on the Great Mall in Washington on the same day. And maybe that was a bad idea. But what ended up on social media was people who looked at a picture. It triggered their biases, and they immediately demonized Nick Sandmann. They posted the principal's contact information and started pummeling him with critical comments. Well, it turns out that the story was complicated, and it doesn't appear that Nick Sandmann himself was acting so provocatively other than wearing that stupid hat. And it turns out that the Native American man, Nathan Phillips, intentionally entered into the fray to try to separate the MAGA kids from the African Americans. And so people acted on their biases. And I just ducked the whole thing. I consider it none of my business. And when this went into viral and out of control, it gave an opening to Trump, who tweeted today, Nick Sandmann and the students of Covington have become symbols of fake news and how evil it can be. They have captivated the attention of the world, and I know they will use it for the good, maybe even to bring people together. Well, obviously, this episode was fed to social media where it sowed division among different kinds of Americans. So obviously, the Russians did it. Over in London, Theresa May is kind of stuck like Trump. It's not a wall, it's the Brexit deal. And she's got her back up against a wall. And she's trying to use warmed-over, leftover plans to make Plan B seem like it's different from Plan A. And they seem to be stuck on Groundhog Day. In Caracas, Venezuela yesterday, 27 members of the National Guard were arrested after attempting to launch a coup against President Nicolas Maduro. Now, you can bet that they had encouragement, if not direct acknowledgement and support from actors like the United States of America. And the coup was snuffed out. It was started overnight, and they rounded up the rebels and locked them up. And that does not mean that Nicolas Maduro is a saint and that everything is fine in Venezuela. But I don't think a military coup, whether it is supported by the United States or organic, is going to be the solution. We saw more airstrikes into Syria from Israel. And once again, Israel is taking the unusual step of acknowledging what they've been doing. They issued a statement saying that they had attacked Iranian military targets in Syria hours after carrying out a rare daylight air raid near the Damascus International Airport. This brazen assault that violates the sovereignty of Syria is becoming quite a pattern. And Israel claims that based on self-defense. It has the right to launch these unilateral strikes into a neighboring country to try to degrade the military resources of Iran. Bizarre. Here's a picture I'm looking at of Lindsey Graham. His military aircraft was not grounded like Pelosi's was last week, as he flew to Turkey, where he met with Recep Tayyip Erdogan and undermined Trump's plans to withdraw American forces from Syria. Now, I keep trying to put a rational frame around this stuff. You'll have to forgive me. And finally today, it took Joe Biden 28 years to finally admit that the positions he took after Len Bias took some crack and died, supporting those draconian drug laws that stiffen the sentences for crack without changing the sentences for powder cocaine, creating this huge disparity because it's blacks who were using crack. They got these incredible long stretches in federal prison, and not the white guys. Now, Joe didn't really take personal responsibility for this. He says it was a big mistake that was made. He just happened to be there. It was made, right? We were told by the experts that crack, you never go back, that the two were somehow fundamentally different. It's not, but it's trapped an entire generation. Biden, who helped pass that 94 crime bill, stunned the audience at an MLK event in Washington, in Washington, when he flatly admitted that he may not have always gotten things right in regards to criminal justice. Well, Joe, I agree with you. And it's why I could never support you for president, even with this late apology. So can you just go back to Delaware and retire? Thanks for listening. I'm Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to you. Keep smiling.